Good evening, everyone. Thank you all participating this evening on this wonderful History Revealed program, which we're very much looking forward to with Dr. Jimmy Patino. I'd like to thank the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library for all their support as co-sponsors for the History Revealed series of programs. Please consider supporting the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library and the Ramsey County Libraries Roseville. You can find more information on our membership, donations, and upcoming programs on our websites, which are up on the screen. And we have some wonderful benefits. And again, that will be on our website. So Peter will talk about what we have coming up in just a minute, but those programs for History Revealed will be continuing through the rest of the year and into next year. So again, we're looking forward to tonight's program and upcoming programs. So as a reminder, please keep your microphones and video cameras turned off during the program. We had a number of people, a big crowd registered tonight, so we'll see who can make it. And we'd like to cut down the interference. When you have a question at the end of the program, please feel free to put that in the chat and we'll get Dr. Patino to answer those questions. The Ramsey County Historical Society would like to acknowledge this sacred Dakota land, Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. Ramsey County Historical Society is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. For our full land acknowledgement statement, you can find that on our website, and that includes actionable ways in which RCHS is pledging to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. We are committed, all of us, the Ramsey County Historical Society, the Eastside Freedom Library, and the Roseville Libraries are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and we're so pleased to bring you tonight's program. So throughout 2022, we are working to bring you programs focused on our series Making Minnesota, which explores the often untold stories, histories, and experiences of some of the worldwide immigrant, African-American, and indigenous communities that make up our most diverse county, Ramsey County. So again, on behalf of the Ramsey County Historical Society, I'm Robin Priestley, and I want to thank all of you for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe from the Eastside Freedom Library to introduce our speaker and say a few words. Peter?
Thank you, Robin. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Jimmy Patino, Associate Professor of Chicano and Latino Studies at the University of Minnesota. Some years back, Dr. Patino presented his book, Raza Si, Migra No, Chicano Movement Struggles for Immigrant Rights in San Diego, which was published in 2017. He's continued to work on issues of desegregation, African-American and Latinx critical thought, hip-hop culture, solidarity among Black, brown, and red power movements, and has really been a model of both a teacher and an activist scholar, active on the campus of the University of Minnesota and active in the wider community. I want to also mention and encourage you to mark your calendars that on September 8th, we will be hearing from Dionisio Valdez, who was Dr. Patino's predecessor in Chicano Studies at the U. And he will be doing a presentation entitled A Shared Community, Chicano Studies at the University of Minnesota. Again, following this theme of the relationship between academic institutions and the communities in which they're situated. So again, that will be a History Revealed program on September 8th. And as Robin said, there are a number of other really excellent programs coming up between now and the end of the year, and we hope that you will join us. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Patino and shut off my video and shut up my mouth and let him educate us. Go for it.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Robin, for the introduction. Let me pull up my PowerPoint here and get going. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Everybody can see that. Yeah, this is great. I really appreciate working with Ramsey County Historical Association and the Eastside Freedom Library again, especially on this project, as I've ventured into kind of new ground, is to study the Midwest a bit, study Minnesota, and which the Twin Cities has been my home for over 10 years now. So being in the Department of Chicano Latino Studies at the University of Minnesota, which is over 50 years old now, alongside my colleagues in Black Studies, American Indian Studies, Asian American Studies, and other critical fields, we become aware of the ways our departments are tied to these people power movements of the 60s and 70s. And so it's always been interesting to me to interrogate that and think about that and recover the narratives about that process. And one thing that came to mind is the existence of the American Indian movement and the broader Red Power movement, the Chicano movement, and Black Power efforts all in the same city here in the Twin Cities, right? Which wasn't necessarily the case in other cities I've studied. I'm from Houston and I've studied Texas a bit. And my book, as Peter mentioned, was on San Diego, where I've talked primarily about African American and Mexican American relations and solidarity building. And so I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to ask the question, what happens when we think about these movements together, right? In what ways are they parallel? In what ways did they intersect? In what ways were they different? In what ways did they diverge, right? And so I, along with Silale Escobar, who is a fantastic former student at Augsburg. She just graduated and she wrote a fantastic senior thesis on the Chicano movement in the Twin Cities and plans to write more on that. So stay tuned for that. We put our heads together a bit during 2020 and COVID and began to think about this as an article-length project. And so it's still in progress. I'm still learning a lot, actually, about the history of Minnesota and the context here, which is a bit different than other urban and border area cities that I've studied, which is exciting, right? And so I'd love feedback, questions, comments about what I put together here for this this presentation. To start out, I'd like to read a little vignette that I wrote regarding an oral history. The cool thing about Zoom, and maybe an unintended positive consequence of COVID, is that we could record interviews on Zoom, right? And as a historian, we could record oral histories on Zoom. And me and Silale had the great pleasure of interviewing Anita Urbina Davis, a veterana, a veteran of the Chicano movement here in the Twin Cities, who played a very important role and continues to be an activist and involved in the community here. So I want to start off with a little vignette I wrote that explores maybe some of the interconnections between these different movements. Anita Urbina, an organizer of the Centro Cultural Chicano, the Chicano Cultural Center, remembers growing up in North Minneapolis among a small but close group of Mexican families that grew up alongside, especially their Black neighbors and community. Centro Cultural Chicano was a site in which Mexican folk dances, music, and culture were celebrated, taught, and reinfused. And while not directly overlapping with similar Black cultural spaces, they drew inspiration from one another in diverse neighborhoods in places like the North Side. The Centro Cultural Chicano, as I'll talk about more later, was initially located in the North Side. As will be discussed, the Black Power social service community organization, The Way, in North Minneapolis was such a place of Black cultural renaissance and celebration, among many things. A Chicana from the North Side, Urbina, remembered The Way as a young girl, just being part of the North Side community. She said, well, you can't help it if you grew up in North Minneapolis. You can't help but know what's going on, unquote. What was going on was that the community and the cultural side of The Way and its impact on the community and on creating a context in which aspects of Black culture was celebrated and renewed, with Urbina being one of the founders of an organization that sought to preserve and celebrate Mexican culture and community. She demonstrates a subtle but vital connection between Black and Chicano power, the attempt to decolonize their communities. If she could not help but know The Way was a dynamic site of cultural studies, cultural struggle, she similarly could not help drawing connection, understanding, and overlapping praxis of this struggle in its tie with her outlook on culture as a site of struggle in a white supremacist context. The Way and Centro Chicano in these ways are intimately linked as sites in which denigrated African and Mexican cultures were insurgently valued, explored, and practiced in these autonomous places for Black and brown people. As we'll see, similarly, the American Indian movement engaged the violence of their own pressures to assimilate, in part through their own native-oriented survival schools. As Julia Davis asserts in her study of the AIM's survival schools, quote, examining AIM through the lens of the survival school reveals a group of parents and community activists working to nurture Native youth, strengthen Indian families, and achieve self-determination within urban institutions. This wasn't so different from what the Black and Chicano communities were doing at The Way and at the Centro Cultural Chicano, as I'll discuss more. Of course, these were seen by the participants as a decolonizing process. Clearly, Chicanas like Urbina in North Minneapolis were aware and observant of Black power from a shared experience of not only geography, but also standpoint of the cultural displacement and struggle to recuperate it. So that's kind of an introduction of some of the ways I'm attempting to interweave a narrative of struggle for standing, for value of particular but different denigrated cultures and communities who are facing material violence and in places of racialized, concentrated poverty, and attempting to build an infrastructure to remedy it, right? And that's what I think so impressive about studying these many movements and a few of the manifestations of institutions that they tried to build within their particular sites of community. Of course, this isn't an exhaustive account of all these movements. So much more work needs to be done on these individual movements and communities, as well as their cross relationships with one another. But I do try to snip out some key kind of stories and narratives that put them in dialogue with one another. The way, the framework I kind of do that with is something that many scholars have called relational ethnic studies, or a lens of relationality, right? Where this framework asserts that racialized groups in particular and the processes that produce their realities are, as Asian American scholar Claire Jean Kim asserts, mutually constitutive, right? They're notions of who the Black community, the Latino community, the Native community are changed through time in the historical process, where they're not only gaining their recognition or being denigrated by the dominant culture, but also being constructed in relationship to other racialized communities, right? Their existence is interrelated and part of the same social fabric, right? And so this is one lens that I try to use to unpack and create a narrative of multi-ethnic struggle in the Twin Cities, right? So what I'm looking for is relational ethnic studies seeks out histories of overt interaction, as I mentioned here, with Irvina's observation and knowledge and engagement with our Black neighbors and Black power institutions, right? Blurred lines of identity between these different communities, blurred lines of ideological or overlapping ideological vision and experience of structures within what I call racial capitalism. I use that term racial capitalism, which comes from a Black scholar, political theorist, Cedric Robinson, to just identify the ways in which race and racial formation are central to capitalist enterprise, right? Central to creating the capitalist social relations that have evolved over the last several centuries, brought over from Western Europe. So that's kind of the framework, right? And so one thing thinking about these groups together does is allows us to take a step back and think about the history of this particular place on Dakota land and its evolution through time, and how anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, anti-Mexican sentiment are tools and technologies in which the social structure was and is created, right? And so it kind of gives a different, it begs us to ask the question of how do these different racializations, plural, create the power structures that exist today, right? And so, one quote used to kind of think about this is from historian Natalie Molina and Daniel Martinez Hosang, who say when distinct racial projects are analyzed within the same field of meaning and power, new insights are revealed about the nature of those projects and broader field of racial transformation in which they take shape. In other words, if we look at these different groups, not in isolation from each other, but together, we learn more about how power works at the social structural level in Minnesota, and we can begin to craft or build on a narrative to understand that in order to dismantle it, of course, as an ethnic studies scholar, right? So, our starting point, I don't go into depth around this, but is, of course, the settler colonial roots of contemporary Minnesota, rooted in the displacement of particularly Dakota and Ojibwe peoples, and what will become the state of Minnesota in the 19th century, right? I've shared some interesting books that I've been referenced to by colleagues and comrades to understand this history, right? As I'm also learning about it. In this book, What Does Justice Look Like? From a Dakota perspective, is a really important starting point for that. Of course, my former colleague at St. Cloud State for a year, Chris Lehman, wrote a really interesting book that gets us to think about 19th century Minnesota's complicity in the slave system as a means of understanding its thoroughly integrated anti-Blackness that was central to the creation of the social relations in the society. Of course, while Minnesota was not based on slave labor in the 19th century and earlier, and it legally discouraged slave ownership, Chris and other scholars talk about how it developed in an anti-Black ontological way, which that was embedded in the social relations that created the ideal citizenry in Minnesota as becoming a state in the United States, right? And so that's also an important place to start. Similarly, thinking about the deep history of the way capitalism developed in Minnesota through the recruitment and utilization of immigrant labor, beginning with a multi-ethnic migration of European migrants, of course, but also especially by the late 19th, really early 20th century, the recruitment of Mexican and Mexican-American migrant laborers, particularly in the harvesting of beets and other crops. Many Mexican origin beet pickers, veteleros, they were called, were US citizens and came from South Texas and other places like that, but also from North and Central Mexico as well. Their treatment, of course, as Mexican-American historians have long discussed, was fundamentally different than the treatment of many European immigrants, in that their entrance into US society was through a war of conquest, where anti-Mexican sentiment was something also embedded within the creation of the ideal American citizen. And their Mexicans' colonial status was one way in which they were kind of incorporated into society at a subordinate level. And so many narratives of these migrant workers are ones in which they were treated harshly. They had difficult conditions, both in the rural areas where they picked crops, but also as they began to settle in places like West St. Paul and the West Side Flats in the 20th century, facing forms of discrimination, segregation, and whatnot in those settings. Probably the best book still on that is Dionisio Dennis Valdez's Barrios Norteños, which, as Peter said, will be featured talking about the history of the department I work for in the coming weeks. And so these are important kind of a starting points in which we contextualize the ways in which the structure of contemporary Minnesota was based on these racializing policies and practices. So more particularly thinking about the growth of the African-American community, in particular in the Twin Cities. Of course, the Upper Midwest was another center of the Great Black Migration in the early to mid 20th century, where migrants from the U.S. South and from other metropolises sought out new lives and to escape more overt forms of violence in the South and in other cities, only to find new forms of segregation and exclusion in Western and Northern cities. In particular, there's been some great work on housing covenants in the Twin Cities and the contemporary post-civil rights de facto segregation that continues to geographically limit the Black community in its development, which is a form of extraction in terms of ensuring wealth for white-only neighborhoods. And the tie redlining and other things have to that particular history. So that's the context in which Black power emerges in the 1960s to address some of these limitations around housing segregation and discrimination, in addition to job displacement or high unemployment. However, of course, African Americans established vibrant homes and centers of daily life, right, in places like North Minneapolis and Western St. Paul and in South Minneapolis. If you haven't checked out Minnepedia online, I've done this presentation to some degree for K through 12 teachers, and I reference them to Minnepedia, which is a great resource for learning about Minnesota history, and great pictures and teaching sources, which here square dance at the Holly Q. Brown Center in the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul in the 1950s. I highlight these sites of cultural community centers as places where mobilization began, right? Where communities of color came together to have fun, to learn from one another, catch relief from some of the harsher sides of life. And you see folks dancing and smiling and whatnot. And again, these spaces were crucial to the creation and attempt to create a kind of autonomous institutions in their own communities later in the 60s, which I'll be focusing on. Of course, the American Indian communities, the Twin Cities, by the mid 20th century, Minneapolis had become among the largest urban Indian communities in the country, right? This was a direct result of policy shifts at the federal and local level that sought to push Native people away from reservations in an attempt to kind of undermine the sovereignty of Native people on their sovereign territories, on the reservations, and have a formal relocation program where masses of Native peoples were encouraged and pressured to migrate to urban spaces. Of course, the Twin Cities there were formal relocation sites. The Twin Cities wasn't a formal relocation site. However, it was an informal one, surely, as the Native population grew exponentially at this time. Dakota, Ojibwe, and other indigenous people sought in this urban context. The majority were Ojibwe, right, to maintain cultural practices, language, and ties to the sovereign lands established by treaty in Minnesota and elsewhere. And they adjusted to an urban environment, of course, again, with concentrated poverty, racist treatment, and underemployment. And some of these struggles, we'll see the ways in which they overlap amongst these different racialized groups in the urban context, right? And this is where we can begin to think about them coinciding, at least in a parallel way, in their struggles for autonomy and power, as well as intersecting in certain ways out of these shared struggles, right? I'll talk more about the survival schools a bit. Here's some images from one of the American Bible schools, the Heart of the Earth Survival School that was in Phillips neighborhood in Minneapolis. Or actually, it was near the University of Minnesota area, I think in its latest iteration. But again, creating community space, folks smiling, educating children, and really, as I'll go into, countering the violent assimilation that was directed at Native peoples in this context, in this situation, and trying to retain and maintain and expand their cultural practices, and address some of the material struggles that they were embedded in the Phillips neighborhood and other places in the cities. Finally, contextualizing Mexicans in Minnesota, again, as I mentioned, they were recruited initially in the agricultural industry. By World War II, they began to gain some industrial jobs or service jobs in urban areas, and to settle more permanently in West St. Paul and other areas of the Twin Cities. Of course, the West Side became the first barrio, the first Mexican-American neighborhood, and continues to be a major cultural center of Chicano and Latino culture, right? And so here's an image from Minnepedia again, and actually this is from the Minnesota Historical Society, of the Lady of Guadalupe Church. The ethnic Catholic Church, of course, was a central organizing and mobilizing site for Mexican-American communities, who has celebrated the Mexican Independence Day at least since the 1950s, if not before, right? And here's some preparing of food and whatnot. The Cinco de Mayo celebration in West St. Paul is still a very important celebration that comes out of this history as well, that I'd encourage folks to check out. So again, to think about these, the Red Power, Black Power, and Chicano Power movements together is another way to think about working class people collectively as not only being subordinated by oppressive circumstances, but also collectively and in parallel and intersecting ways, resisting those oppressive circumstances, right? So I use this quote from comparative ethnic scholar Luis Alvarez: "A class is not assumed to be a predefined group of people based on similar relationship of subordination and exploitation of capital, right? But also might be a group based on their insubordination to domination." And that's really how I'd like to think about the emergence of these movements together, right? What I think these people power movements shared in common were a notion of self-determination, an attempt to collectively unify as a racialized working class community, and gain control of their own communities and solve their own problems in an autonomous way, right? That's one way in which self-determination might be defined loosely across groups, although these groups, of course, have different histories, and also applied Black, brown, and red power in different ways tied to their particular historical trajectories and issues, right? I mean, we can think of the American Indian community in particular, where self-determination means something really different when you are a sovereign nation within a nation and you have treaties kind of identifying that. That's a different relationship to the US state. Among Native peoples, that diverges from the experience of Black American and Mexican American peoples. And so those are also some differences that exist. But one way self-determination and these power movements may be overlapped in their conception of the activity, the self-activity that they've created, was to gain autonomy and build institutions to solve their own problems, right? And so that's one way to think about it, with the caveat they're also very different in terms of their particular experience and histories and conditions, right? In regards to those overlapping conditions, right? Again, the urban context kind of put them in dialogue because they were really, in many ways, struggling against some of the same social forces. And it shows at a political, economic level that anti-Mexican, anti-Black, and anti-Indian sentiment was available to the power structure to apply in these different circumstances, right? So if you can think of racism not as "I don't like you," but more around a set of knowledge, a bank of knowledge that's utilized by elites to accomplish certain things, that's a starting point for understanding the particular ways these different communities kind of overlapped in some of their urban conditions in Twin Cities. So of course, struggles with police violence, struggles with violence of poverty and segregation, struggles with forms of displacement, being uprooted from their communities, early forms of gentrification in mid-century, so on and so forth. As I've alluded to, probably the main thing we've so far talked about in this research is overlapping struggles against assimilation and kind of affirming their cultural difference, and countering a colonial education that was undermining or devaluing their cultures and practices and their identities. Of course, struggles with invisibility, neglect, stigmatization in what was a very white state, especially back then. And then overt kind of racism juxtaposed to the emergence of liberalism that also had a racializing form, right? That purported to be in the interest of folks of color, but in practice kind of was, right? In fact, some of the stuff I'm reading on liberalism and its origins in Minnesota, particularly in its kind of civil rights and anti-racist iterations, show that it wasn't really a project of and including folks of color in leadership. Much rather, it was a shift by the Democratic Party to kind of gain hegemony in a certain kind of moment, right? And I think the emergence of Black brown and red power by the late 60s and early 70s, after racial liberalism establishes the Civil Rights Act of 64 and other successes legislatively, reveals the limitations of racial liberalism, right? That these power movements were a sounding board for that racial liberalism is significantly limited and not solving our concrete problems, right? And so that's something I'm meditating on as I'm developing this research as well and learning more about. Okay, so the particular manifestations of these power movements that we particularly concentrate on, as I've mentioned in the vignette, right, the way Unlimited Incorporated was a Black power oriented community center that used to exist off Plymouth Avenue, where ironically, maybe deliberately, the 4th Precinct Police Station is now at the site where the way used to be. And so it emerged in the mid-1960s, founded by Syl Davis, to really give youth a place to interact, to learn, to be occupied, to stay out of trouble, to develop all kinds of infrastructure to address some of the Black community's needs. And so that's one key organization that we've looked at. I've mentioned the Centro Cultural Chicano. Also, the Centro Cultural emerged in 1972. And also talk about the Brown Berets, who were a chapter of a nationwide organization founded initially in East Los Angeles, but that spread through urban communities throughout the country, that really sought to address the discrimination Mexican Americans and the second-class colonial experience of Mexican Americans since the Mexican American War in the mid-19th century. That kind of framework was the goal of the Brown Berets, and they established a chapter in West St. Paul. And of course, as I mentioned, the American Indian Movement survival schools, right? So this is one, again, what's so impressive, I think, and important about these movements was their institutionalization of really dynamic sites of solving their own problems, right? So this image of the structure of the way on the north side really shows all the kind of social problems and issues it attempted to solve, right? Gives us a glimpse of dynamic ideas and attempt to address all the social problems I listed before, right? So this again was key. I mean, this is an autonomous self-activity, self-determined way of solving the community social problems, was to this kind of organization and goals, right? And so this shows again the array of different things that the way, here's an image of the way in the late 60s, and an image of kind of a gathering, a party, or there were dances there. There were music classes. It was a site, I think, that's been a place where someone like Prince practiced music and performed music. Again, a dynamic place of cultural renaissance, but also solving concrete problems, drug use in the community, real engagement with attempting to get folks, formerly incarcerated folks, on their feet, and resourced to re-engage the community. Again, a number of different things, right? Somewhat similarly, the Centro Cultural Chicano, here's a kind of newspaper clipping from the center. And one of the co-founders was Dr. Marcela Trujillo, who taught at the University of Minnesota and was also very much involved with the founding of the Department of Chicano Studies, now the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies, in the 70s. And also wrote a number of different poems and analyses really an early proponent and inventor of Chicano feminism. Hey Chicano boss man, don't tell me that machismo is part of our culture is an excerpt from her poems, kind of calling out the sexism within the movement and its kind of contradictory existence in a movement that was for social justice. And so she was a very important part of this. Silali's work has really unpacked her thesis on Mexican American women in the Chicano movement in the Twin Cities. I think will have an important impact and teach us so much more about that movement. But her involvement in the Centro was vitally important. So cultural revitalization, right, and cultural renaissance, countering the colonial education system is really important to kind of some of the overlaps and parallels that existed between these different groups. I'd like to read another brief excerpt from some of the writing that we've done, where kind of addressing police violence and safety concerns in the community were also things that overlapped and intertwined with one another. And the creation raised in the movement patrol in South Minneapolis, and the existence of two kind of safety organizations and police groups that observed and kind of policed the police in many ways. The Soul Force, which is a formal part of the way, and the Black Patrol, which was a more interventionist and armed group of African American activists in the North Side, in many ways akin to the Black Panther patrols that existed in other cities at the time. And so a brief excerpt from that, in ways we can maybe intertwine these histories to tell a multi-ethnic narrative. I start with my interview with leader of the Black student organization, the Afro-American Action Committee at the University of Minnesota. I interviewed Horace Huntley actually for the Eastside Freedom Library just before COVID hit, which was a wonderful experience to learn from Horace, who became also a scholar of Black labor. But as a founding student activist who found Black studies at the University of Minnesota, he remembered, quote, "We had been involved with the American Indian movement, very closely associated with them." He said, anytime we had something going, we'd always call on them. When they had something going, they'd call on us. There was, in the Franklin Avenue area, a lot of poverty. People had been brought in from some of the reservations. There was always something that needed attending to. And there was a relationship between a few of us on campus and the Native Americans. We cooperated in several ways, he says. And so as a student, Huntley recalled that his relationship with AIM and the indigenous community off Franklin Avenue was but an extension and part and parcel to the community grassroots practice of the student movement and the Black struggle at the time. It was vitally important for the student movement to be tied to these community-based institutions that existed at the same time, right? And so connecting to AIM was just a part of this kind of commitment to tie the student movement to the community for Huntley, right? In this way, solidarity was a means of being at the service of the most oppressed and struggling among us, and that this extended to other racialized groups. As Huntley recalls the concentrated poverty in the Native community that AIM and others were at the forefront of battling, to be able to, as he puts it, call upon us and quote unquote call upon them, right, was the language of solidarity, right? Possibly due to the small numbers of non-white activists in the Twin Cities, but also out of the consciousness of the movements that evolved, considered a kind of third world or decolonial perspective that was aware of the ways in which white dominance and racial capitalist structures held its particular pressures on different groups in different ways, but that they recognized, in this case, in the Black community's own repression, right? They saw their own oppression in others' oppression, the way Horace and others have put it. In a more recent article in the Washington Times, Ojibwe scholar Katrina Phillips recalls the history of the American Indian movement struggle against the police, against police violence, and how this tied to a longer relationship with the Black community. She's writing in the wake of the recent unrest over the police murder of George Floyd, of course, recently, and how the AIM patrol still exists in that moment as well. Minneapolis Northside Ray scholar Camille Maddox highlights the co-creation of and for the people law firm by members of the Way and the American Indian movement. This law firm was created together amongst Native and Black activists. The law firm sought to address what the creator saw as public defender system of Minnesota that was underfunded, understaffed, and insensitive to cultural issues. And it reveals how closely Black and Native artists were in dialogue with one another, and that they identified the criminal justice system from the police to the courts as a primary site of repression for their communities. So as I mentioned, police brutality and public safety was probably some of the most overt forms of repression that Chicanos, Chicanas, and African Americans and Native Americans struggled against in relationship to one another and in parallel forms in the way that this manifested in their own neighborhoods, right? Police repression, again, it doesn't matter that they're differently racialized, right? A similar policy and practice of harassment, of brutality, of repression, of violence was practiced in Native, Chicano, and Black neighborhoods, right? And so this shared struggle, right, was a key in which we could see some overlap, right? As so many scholars and activists have written, policing is a institution in day-to-day life of Black, Brown, and Native communities that affects their well-being and proximity to violence. The Brown Berets in West St. Paul emerged in part to patrol the police and determine routine ways in which, or intervene in routine ways in which police officers would harass Mexican origin activists in particularly West St. Paul. Their presence actually increased police repression as the Berets were seen as a street gang, right? And you see their militarized garb here, where they wore a Black beret. They saw themselves as kind of a militarized army in defense of Mexican American rights, right? Their depiction as a street gang by the police and by other elites indicates how policing institutions criminalize brown folks, right? Gangs being one racializing process in which folks of color are targeted, right? Concerns about police harassment were so central to the race that, as indicated when Silali interviewed Gilberto de la O, he replied when asked about women's involvement. He said women were very involved as foot soldiers, as organizers, and when fighting the cops, if necessary, the way he put it. Similarly, again, the Way's member Dan Pothier helped create the Black Patrol, which emerged in direct response to the police instigation of the 1967 Plymouth Avenue riots, when they patrolled the neighborhood, armed themselves, and reportedly broke up small incidences following the assassination of MLK in 1968. Inspired by Black Power leader Stokely Carmichael, his call that Black people only be protected by each other, the group rode in cars and came to handle situations that required physical intervention. The Black Patrol at times worked to prevent violence in the community when the police failed to show up to implement some community control over law enforcement. Other times, there's indications that they worked with the Minneapolis Police Department. It was not a formal part of the Way's activities, but the emergence of the Soul Force was a nonviolent kind of form of this. They were unarmed, and an outgrowth of the Way and the Black Patrol themselves. And of course, the AIM Patrol was developed right around the same time in 1968 as a way to defend Native Americans from police brutality. The roots of the American Indian movement are around police harassment of Native people along Franklin Avenue at bars and other, places of social convening that emerged. So that was a key reason why they emerged, right? The AIM Patrol was a crisis resolution alternative, as they put it. Those who worked with the AIM Patrol worked alongside with the Black Patrol of Minneapolis, which had a similar goal as the AIM Patrol, protected neighborhoods that were predominantly Native American from police violence, right? One more key point I want to share about practices in terms of safety is the way that all these organizations not only saw the site of police brutality as, you know, the primary site of intervention, right? To prevent so-called crime, they sought to eradicate poverty, right? To eradicate concentrated poverty, and really how these communities in ways worked as a reserve force for the Twin Cities, right? Which caused high unemployment, low wages, rights when they were employed. These were the roots of what they saw as police and safety issues interresidentially as well, not only from the police, but violence between, say, gangs. For the Brown Berets, gang intervention in the West Side community was central to their work to kind of settle those disputes amongst gangs, to get youth into programming, job searching entities, playing sports, playing baseball, or going on camping trips, right? Get youth to pull them out of so-called criminal activity and address the roots of crime, not when the crime is being committed, right? But when the context and policies that exist to create the need for criminal activity, or the perceived need for criminal activity. So that, I think that's a very important aspect that as we continue to deal with issues of so-called crime and policing, right? These are really insightful practices that these groups had with one another. So I'd like to conclude by again the way in which not only these organizations had parallel practices and parallel kind of conditions in which they fought. And we found some moments of interaction, right, of overt interaction with one another. And I want to read another part that explores some other moments of overt interaction with one another. And really the ideological and tenet that being concerned and aware of one another's colonial struggles and how they're different, but how they were related, or how they were at least of concern, is something that we're finding, right? That is something that exists in Red Power, Black Power, and Chicano Power, is that there was concern for other third world peoples, right? To put it that way, which is really pushed back against the notion that ethno-racial nationalisms kind of isolate them from one another. Much rather, in this context, at least in some formulations, right, there was genuine and important concern and collaboration, right? The consciousness of this Black, Brown, and Red Power units that we've concentrated on today is indicated by their insistence to create a practice of not only parallel work and occasional support with one another when called in, but deepening an understanding, a commitment to deepen their understanding of one another through dialogue, grassroots communication, grassroots education, and notions of a wider relationship against the shared coloniality and the struggle with racism. While segregating forces tended to concentrate different communities in different parts of the cities, for example, West St. Paul for Mexican Americans, the near North Side for African Americans, Phillips neighborhood for Native Americans, these living patterns were far from stable. As mentioned with Anita Urbina Davis, who testified to the small but important Mexican American community in the Minneapolis North Side, these Chicana and Chicano youth went to North High School, right, and made friends with so many of what would become the activist leadership in the Black community. Brown Beret veteran Rodolfo Salcedo recalled Native, Black, and white participants in their youth camping trip programs. They would lead to keep youth occupied and out of trouble during the summertime. So their camping trips were multi-ethnic and maybe addressed the ways in which Native, Black, and working class white youth were also at St. Paul and part of their programming. Curriculum, programming, information shared and sharing with one another included concern and solidarity with each other, right? The AIM survival schools, right? The Heart of the Earth School and the Red Schoolhouse was the St. Paul version of the AIM schools, taught about the Black freedom movement and taught about its ties to Black power. The Native youth that attended these schools, these were K through 12 youth, Native students engaged with themes of a broader indigenous communities. Also, these communities were exploring identities in their larger global iterations. Right? So global indigeneity was being explored among the American Indian movement schools and activities as they taught about Native communities in Mexico and Central America and in the Americas. This was also part of their expansive ties beyond their particular tribal affiliations. As indigenous leaders from the Navajo Nation, Larry Anderson visited the school. These schools lasted until the early 90s. So Guatemalan indigenous leader Rigoberta Menchú visited at one point. Cree Nation scholar Buffy St. Marie visited. Stokely Carmichael visited these survival schools in his visit, which I assume was his visit to the Way, which caused a bit of concern among mainstream elites when he visited Minneapolis and the Twin Cities. But he took the time to visit the AIM, the American Indian Movement schools, of course, solidarity. And reportedly, the Chicago Brown Berets visited the American Indian Movement schools and shared, I assume, their struggles and their perspectives as Mexican origin activists. The Way offered classes at the community level, from music to history courses, and also demonstrated an internationalist and third world solidarity in teaching classes on Native Americans. They taught a class in Hebrew, addressing the Jewish American element in the North Side. And third world studies was also a class they reportedly taught. Like Pan-Indianism, they explored broader notions of the Black diaspora and internationalism, exploring connections to Africa. Youth visited Ghana, for example, in 1968. And I think this broader diasporic notion encouraged a third worldist practice and interest in, and really a political commitment to be aware of the diversity of peoples that held maybe similar and overlapping anti-colonial struggles. As the Way's educational director, Mahmoud El-Kati, reveals a sentiment of solidarity when he depicts the Way as, quote, the one place where district groups, Black, white, and red, Christian, Jews, and Muslims, those living high and those living low, could need and look at one another. Yes, the lowest, the least, and the lost, and the rich people who could still claim a human face held communion, at the way El-Kati put it. So while his quote is aspirational, right, and where the lowest among us kept precedent in the practice of Black power there, El-Kati's words reveal the simultaneous centering of the Black experience alongside the notion of communion and solidarity at the same time. So I think that may be a good stopping point, an opportunity to open it up. I'd love to hear feedback, questions, concerns that folks may have. Thank you so much for listening, and yeah, look forward to dialoguing with you.
Thank you, Jimmy. This is Peter for everybody out there. I'm going to try to read questions so that Jimmy doesn't have to track them in the chat. We have a question from Chloe. Why did the survival schools close? And are current schools like the Center School directly connected to them?
That's a great question. Let's see, I'll reference to a good book that I've got a lot of my information from, Survival Schools. Can you see that? Survival Schools, the American Indian Movement and Community Education in the Twin Cities by Julie Davis, who explores, and the survival schools lasted a long time, into the early 90s. I think they lasted, and they were founded in 1972 or 74, I believe. And so, I mean, one of the struggles with the survival schools and with these autonomous spaces more broadly, thinking about the way and the Centro Cultural Chicano as well, excuse me, there were always struggles for funding and resources, which always made things kind of challenging. There was a time where the survival schools were, and it was something that really allowed them to take off, were that they did receive funding from the public school system at one point and from the state education system. And so that really helped, of course, resource them and operate them. The decline of kind of public support for schools generally, a lot to do with the struggles the schools had to kind of stay intact. So this was a problem with so finding resources and funding sources was often challenging. I think, I would refer to the book for a more precise kind of reason on the decline of the survival schools. But there was also, by the late 70s and early 80s, this shift to kind of a more professionalized nonprofit sector that, kind of catered to social services, which kind of, in some ways, I'm getting the sense marginalized the more politicized approach that these grassroots activists had, right? So in other words, getting funding from formal nonprofits like the United Way required a kind of professionalization that maybe depoliticized the social service. And those were issues that emerged. I know that emerged with the way some of my reading and research of it, that the United Way kind of took it over and basically marginalized Syl Davis and some of the original founders of the way, arguing that the way needs to change and become more professional. I mean, I have direct quotes from United Way people telling the way organizers that. And so that's maybe some indication of some of the perils that make this kind of semi-autonomous institution building so difficult. And there's, of course, also ongoing indigenous education centers and community-based social service and whatnot that do have roots with maybe not the survival schools in particular, but definitely the American Indian Movement and their broader kind of attempt to institutionalize some of their community problem-solving institutions. I'm forgetting the name of the law firm right now, but that law firm, the aim and the way collaboration to create basically a people's kind of law firm, it still exists, right? And it may be called the People's Legal Center or something like that, but that still exists. Many of these institutions still exist. The Centro Cultural Chicano, as Hilali writes about so eloquently, became Centro Tyrone Guzman, which today is a social service agency that serves the Latinx community in South Minneapolis and whatnot. So many of these institutions, to riff off your question and expand it to some of the other entities I look at, did create kind of a foundation for the continuance of kind of serving the community in some ways, but as mentioned with the nonprofit sector and whatnot, not without its kind of challenges and difficulties.
Thank you. Tess has raised a question about the framing of this whole story. Can characterizing Minnesota as a, quote, labor-friendly and liberal progressive state, unquote. And I wonder, Jimmy, if you might back out to the larger frame. And I think some of what you've just said about how the rise of social services and other kinds of institutions have absorbed, co-opted, limited some of this activism that you've been talking about. But I wonder if you might say a little bit more about Minnesota's political history in particular and how that has impacted these struggles for Black, Brown, and Red power.
Yeah, that's a great, and I think something that really provoked our interest in these movements in Minnesota is, the idea that, and the reality that, Minnesota was the center of the emergence of kind of the civil rights liberalism. If you think about the Hubert Humphrey, the Mondales, different kind of democratic liberal leaders, really advocated and instituted some of the legal framework for implementing civil rights guarantees or civil rights legal changes. And again, I don't know if it's an irony or it's something that we need to interrogate, right? Because again, I think the very existence of these power groups indicates I don't even want to call it failure. I don't think it was a deliberate failure. I think liberalism was in and of itself never meant to serve, and hold in leadership, particularly African American peoples who were at the center of liberalism, right? And then these other groups kind of fit in kind of an afterthought in kind of liberal discourse. Much rather, the liberalism built was meant to, navigate and manage the emergent civil rights movement at a national level. And Minnesota was one interesting place that emerged from. But I think where I start with these, with the violent roots of Minnesota history in, the Dakota War, in kind of anti-Black violence, complicity in slavery, the agricultural complex, exploitation of immigrant labor. Those were the kinds of problems that liberalism didn't get to the root of, because those would actually require intervention in, if not dismantling, of primary kind of capitalist social functions or capitalist kind of development, which liberalism is not attempting to dismantle. The industrialization and broadening of and growth of a capitalist economic system, right? And so it took these movements to, one, the suffering that people were undergoing in the way that people were dislocated again to urban spaces, not provided with the social needs that folks might need in such a shift in migration, and to be left kind of struggling in an area of concentrated poverty. Same thing with the Black migration to places like the North Side or South Minneapolis, to be subject to kind of control and violence by police, interracial violence due to a lack of job. I mean, the Plymouth riots, and there were two iterations in 1966 and the larger one in 1967, were all about, in many ways, the way is dialoguing with youth about no access to jobs, no access to kind of a way to make a living, and maybe early indication of the deindustrialization of urban areas. Of course, those hit Black folks first, because of the way the economy was structured to, privileged white workers and industrializing skilled labor to the exclusion of Black folks and other and Native and Mexican folks as well. And so yeah, so these issues weren't addressed in the larger kind of discourse because they weren't the primary priority to change the economic concerns of Black and brown folks. Much rather, they wanted to change the legal framework, which was more cosmetic in terms of addressing civil rights, right? There was less consequences materially if you didn't address the concentrated poverty of these communities. And so, yeah, it took these organizations to bring them up and demand that they be addressed. And maybe, and I'm still learning about this. And so I hope, I'd love to hear more comments or questions about it in the way that may have worked in terms of for local legislation or legal practices, civil rights programs. But I guess another big concern here is labor, right? In a labor-friendly state where unions were successful in comparison to the rest of the country, the embedded racism of the union movement and the inability for them too often to fully incorporate the particular work experiences of Black, brown, and Native workers, or folks who weren't able to be in the formal labor market. The inability for unions to incorporate their concerns, or even to practice exclusionary practices through the embedment of racism in unions, really speaks to those inabilities. And yeah, also the kind of these movements had something to do with the intervention of the nonprofit industrial complex and its depoliticizing tendencies. And again, this is something I'd like to study more, but it is, I have studied in other places, and I think it is part of the answer to that really complex question. And something we should
Jimmy, the Zoom gods are giving me, in my screen, it says your network bandwidth is low. I wonder if you stop the screen sharing.
Okay. We'll try that.
Excellent. I want to make a point about, or share a point about the labor movement and give everybody a sneak preview that the brilliant, passionate, committed Nick Estes has moved to the University of Minnesota and joined the American Indian Studies Department. And he came to the Eastside Freedom Library doing research on the role of Native Americans in the 1934 Minneapolis Teamsters strike. And I suspect that we will get a new way of looking at the Minneapolis Teamsters strikes through the work of Nick Estes. And someday we may have him here on History Revealed, sharing his research with us, which I greatly look forward to. I wanted to share another question, maybe reformulate it just a wee bit. Marco Cruz has asked, what do you think the lessons are that those generations that you've been studying would like to share with contemporary generations? And I think at the Eastside Freedom Library, we like to talk about the ongoing conversation between the past and the present. So in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the uprising, which some have called the greatest civil rights, racial justice uprising in the history of the United States, what do you think that conversation is, Jimmy, between the movements of the 60s and the movements of the 2020s?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you, Peter, for mentioning. I'm really excited about the research you suggested that Nick Estes is doing, and that's that's something I also want to learn about and maybe think about in terms of the emergence of these movements I'm looking at in the 60s and 70s, is that in my other work, the 1930s was a crucial moment in which the labor movement, the Communist Party, the CIO was able to engage and meaningfully include and where Black and brown folks saw as useful unions in the labor movement to continue their struggles for their material and interest in their struggles with racialization. And so I think that's an untold story that I've ran across so far in terms of the way Black, brown, and Native folks participated in the 30s movements that were so important and striking. And yeah, I look forward to it and want to preface that in terms of that's also a missing or an important piece to this larger conversation. Maybe it's interesting to think about that earlier kind of leftist movement in the 30s, think about it in the 60s and 70s and how it got re-articulated in these kind of third world colonial kind of solidarity ways. And yeah, to reflect on how it may speak to the present, particularly as the Twin Cities became, the focus of so much of the country and the world after the brutal public lynching of George Floyd and the uprisings that emerged out of that. And I think, one question I want to answer better, and I'm just going to throw out there is, how did these movements decline, which I've talked a little bit about it. Because in the post-George Floyd moment, it is really interesting to see how these organizations and these movements were solving the very problem that we're still kind of up against, right? The violence from a racializing police force that targets especially Native and Black communities. The emergence of a policing system that targets migrants as the Latino population has grown, which is another aspect of police repression that exists here in the Twin Cities in this moment, right? So these communities have to solve these problems on our own terms before, and there's some sort of repressive mechanism definitely that made these movements decline in many ways, to where we have a George Floyd moment that happens in the more contemporary moment. One thing I'll say is the George Floyd uprisings is super interesting to think about them through a multi-ethnic lens, right? Especially now at the Twin Cities, and is much more diverse than it was in the 1960s and 70s in terms of numbers of Asian American, Latinx, African diaspora communities. And yeah, so what does a black-white lens doesn't work in this context, right? Even though anti-blackness is central to us, our understanding of it. And so some of the tensions that were created between immigrant businesses and the uprising that were kind of destroyed, some of the businesses that were destroyed, those points of tension, I think, need to be reframed and understood and unpacked in order to build solidarity and understanding between the forces that do that. One South Asian immigrant store owner mentioned that, and his business was destroyed, mentioned that, well, my business is a small price to pay for the struggle for Black life, right? And so that to me was a really in the spirit of these third world movements that recognized that there is concern around the ways in which racist violence affects one another, not just our own particular community. One thing I think that would be interesting, yeah, thank you, I couldn't remember his name, who was the owner of the restaurant in South Minneapolis, the Indian restaurant. I think another thing is these people power movements were working class movements in terms that they had tensions with their own middle classes and their own elites within their communities, right? So maybe today where we may look at other communities and ask them to explore their internalized anti-Blackness or internalized anti-Indian or settler colonial sentiment, which is important to do, right? All our communities need to do that. We all need what these third world movements in the 70s were kind of suggesting was that the notion that there's tension between Black and brown people, for instance, doesn't serve working class brown people. They are in common than they don't. And it's actually a kind of a bourgeois notion for the internalization of anti-Blackness in gay Latino communities, right? So rather than a kind of confession of anti-Blackness that the Latino community kind of articulates, these movements were much rather taking positions that we are a colonized community too, and anti-Black is counter to our well-being, but because we're in solidarity with our Black and Native comrades, right? In their own struggle with the same coloniality that we're in struggle with. And so the language is a bit different and the positioning is a bit different. And I think seeing them as kind of middle class, bourgeois notions that try to pit us against one another is one way these movements were articulated that I've seen less of in the present moment, but of course there's so much to learn about the present moment that maybe I haven't seen yet. But that's one thing that I think that those movements might speak to the contemporary struggle.
Thank you. I want to give a shout out to an Eastside Freedom Library board member, Sangay Taiti, who is an organizer for SEIU Healthcare Minnesota and has played a big role in creating an organization called Tibetans for Black Lives, which started here in the Twin Cities and now has organizations in 5 countries. So I think embodying the kinds of things, Jimmy, that you're talking about.
Sure, absolutely.
And so I encourage you all to Google Tibetans for Black Lives and see the kind of work that Sangay and his comrades are doing. We're running out of time. We might have time for one more question if anyone would like to pose one. Or we can draw the evening to a close. I want to thank Jimmy, Professor Patino from Chicano and Latino Studies at the University of Minnesota. And thank you all for coming. Remind you that there will be a video available on the YouTube pages of both the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library for you to share with your comrades who could not join us tonight. And I also want to remind you that on September 8th, Dionisio Valdez will be joining us to talk about really the impact of these struggles that Jimmy's been talking about tonight, their impact back on the academy in the development of Chicano studies at the University of Minnesota. And please stay tuned for more events like these being co-sponsored by Ramsey County Historical Society, Roseville Public Library, and the Eastside Freedom Library. So again, thank you so much, Professor Jimmy Patino, for joining us tonight. And thank you all. We didn't have to get out of our pajamas to participate in this. So thank you to Zoom for that. We didn't have to get wet in the rain. Thank you, Robin Priestley. Thank you, Judy Woodward. Thank you, Clarence White, for helping to make this happen this evening.